Today's program, written by Maria Fernanda de Andrade Lippard, concerns Fernando Pessoa, modernist poet born in 1888 in Portugal, who is credited with bringing modernism to Portuguese literature and art. We found it very fitting today to film our program here in Things of Beauty Gallery on Lark Street in Albany. It's one of the leading galleries in Albany, and the artist who is currently being displayed, Angel Cupril, also has a connection with modernism. He studied with Angelo Ippolito of the Matisse School of Paris, and so we thought it would be a fitting place to film today's program. The program will be divided into two parts and will be read by Maria Fernanda, who did the research on this subject. We hope you enjoy this program and welcome you to view other programs on Channel 28 in Albany or wherever you might be viewing them, in cultural clubs or on other public access channels. We have other programs in German, on Polish culture in Polish, Spanish, Portuguese, and a number of others. And if you come to the library, we'd be more than happy to show you those or to give you more information concerning them. So I'm going to turn this over now to Maria Fernanda, and again, I hope you enjoy today's program.
The Portuguese poet Sofia de Melo Breiner has declared that in Fernando Pessoa's poetry she found the vitality and actuality of the Portuguese language. It is our wish that in this attempt to make the Portuguese modernist poet better known, the American public may share Miss Breiner's opinion. We divided the program in two parts. In the first part, biographical data and highlights of his literary career are narrated. Obviously, we were restrained by time limitations. The genesis of the heteronyms is explained on the second part of the program. More than half of Pessoa's literary output was written under different names, alter egos, as he preferred to consider them. Some of his orthonomic as well as heteronymic poetry will be recited. The English translation will follow the original Portuguese. Finally, a brief summary will conclude the program. Fernando António Nogueira Pessoa introduced modernism into Portuguese poetry. By his work, Portuguese literature took its place among the European literary movements of the beginning of this century. The poet was born June the 13th, 1888 in Lisbon. June the 13th, St. Anthony's Day, is celebrated with great festivities in Portugal. His middle name, António, was in honor of this popular saint, who is the patron saint of Lisbon. Fernando Pessoa's father, Joaquim Seabra Pessoa, the son of a general from the Algarve, was an educated man who knew languages and who worked as a civil servant and as a music critic. He suffered from tuberculosis and died at 43 years of age, when his son was only 5 years old. The poet's mother, Maria Madalena Pinheiro Nogueira Pessoa, was born in Ilha Terceira, one of the Azorian Islands. She also had received a good education. Fernando, a precocious child who could read and write by age 5, had a very close and happy relationship with his mother, a relationship that was shattered when she remarried. João Miguel Rosa, her second husband, was a Navy officer and the Portuguese consul in Durban in South Africa. Due to his mother's second marriage, Fernando was forced to leave Lisbon. In Durban, he attended an Irish Catholic school where he had his first contact with the English language. From 1899 to 1905, he attended Durban High School. He was an excellent student, a voracious reader, who insisted on speaking perfect English. He dropped the Portuguese circumflex accent over the O in his name, Pessoa, but later began to use the accent again. Some say this might have been an indication of his desire to reaffirm his Portugueseness. In 1916, he decided to drop it again, but by this time his nationalism was well asserted. In 1901, the family, now with 2 more children, returned to Portugal for a 13-month period. They resided in Pedroços with an aunt, Maria Xavier, who composed poetry. This visit is said to have resuscitated his dormant nationalistic sentiments. The Verses of Lisbon Revisited, written 25 years later by his heteronym Álvaro de Campos, were a direct result of this visit. They also visited Ilha Terceira, and there Fernando Pessoa wrote Quando Ela Passa, one of his first poems in Portuguese. When the family returned to South Africa, Fernando Pessoa enrolled in a commercial school, but in 1904 he re-entered Durban High School. At 15 years of age, he received the Queen Victoria Memorial Prize for the best English essay at matriculation examination for the University of Cape Town. He competed against 899 candidates, mostly English. The selection of the books which constituted the prize was left to Pessoa's own choice. He selected the complete works of Ben Jonson, Keats, Tennyson, and Edgar Allan Poe, and Lives of the Poets by Samuel Johnson. He revealed then, with the exception of Ben Jonson and Dr. Johnson, his interest in what was at the time modern poetry. In 1904, he took the intermediate examination in arts at university, and in August of 1905, he returned to his beloved Lisbon. He matriculated in the advanced course in arts at university, but student strikes and disagreement with university policies caused him to leave, thereby ending his formal education. Lonely and unhappy, he was considered a foreigner by his classmates, in his clothes, in his language, and in his culture. Slowly started speaking Portuguese and reading Portuguese authors. He decided to acquire a small printing firm, Ibis, but this proved to be a short-lived venture. He lost all his money and began working as a commercial correspondent in foreign languages. The political life of Portugal was convulsive during the first decade of the 20th century. The king, Dom Carlos, and his heir had been assassinated, and the dictator João Franco was in power. Fernando Pessoa, inflamed in his nationalistic sensibility, became influenced by João Franco's policies and started to write poetry in Portuguese. The period from 1908 to 1914 marks, therefore, the so-called naturalization period, when the poet started to compose in his native language. General Henrique Rosa, brother to the poet's stepfather, introduced him to the Portuguese poets Guerra Junqueiro, Gomes Leal, José Duro, António Nobre, and Cesário Verde, and to the symbolism movement. In January of 1912 was founded in Oporto a literary society, a Renascença Portuguesa, with the magazine Águia as its official voice. Águia reflected a desire for intellectual rebirth, a continuation of the spirit brought to life by the Republican Revolution of 1910. The fundamental theme of Águia was saudosismo, whose essence was the fusion of the past with the future. Pessoa wrote in the magazine as a critic. He believed that a creative literary current would be followed by a glorious social and political future. A super Camões would come to the Portuguese nation. Camões, the Portuguese epic poet, author of the Lusíadas, had died shortly after the Portuguese defeat of King Sebastião in 1578 at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in Morocco. Many believed that King Sebastião was alive and would return to Portugal. Super Camões was a messianic assumption, as it was a reflection of Dom Sebastião's long-awaited return to Portugal. In 1912, in his articles in the Águia magazine, he ascribed to the Portuguese race an important future role, the creation of a Lusitanian civilization. Pessoa, while admiring Father António Vieira, the well-known Portuguese writer and preacher, confessed that his patriotic position was that of an adherent of a mystical nationalism, free from Roman Catholicism and able to create a new messianism. Father António Vieira's História do Futuro is said to have been the seed for Pessoa's messianic concept and for his later book Mensagem, whose original title was Portugal. Mensagem, a collection of 44 poems, was inspired by the history of Portugal and followed the theory that the formation of Portugal and their overseas expansion were the result of the will of God and of man's efforts. Some also claim that the English writers Macaulay and Carlyle had also an influence on Mensagem. Also in 1912, he praised Pátria, Guerra Junqueiro's book written as a reaction to the outrage the Portuguese felt when King Dom Carlos capitulated to an ultimatum sent by the British, who were challenging Portugal's territorial claims in Africa. Pessoa called Pátria the principal work in Portuguese poetry, superior to Camões, the Lusíada. At this time, the poet, aged 24, worked the dull routine of a commercial correspondent during the day. At night, he wrote or visited the coffee houses of Chiado and Rocio, where he held long conversations with other poets. Mário de Sá Carneiro, one of his closest friends, returned from Paris, and the two held long discussions on Picasso, Futurism, and Cubism. In 1913, the artist José de Almeida Negreiros opened an exhibit in Lisbon, and the two met. Pessoa wrote in Águia an article on the painter's style. Later, he would sever his relationship with this magazine. He also began to write the poems that make up Mensagem. He created a new literary movement, Paulismo, and defended poetry with decadent tendencies. Trois chansons mortes, the poems he composed in French, show the characteristics of Paulismo, a type of poetry which is more ethereal than realistic, more evocative than descriptive. In the so-called Paulic phase, three elements are stressed: vagueness, subtlety, and complexity. Impressões do Crepúsculo, published in the Renascença magazine, show these tendencies. Cubism, the end result of a long chain of evolution, starting with the French poets Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and Mallarmé, influenced his friend Mário de Sá Carneiro's poetry. Pessoa, who appreciated Baudelaire, believed that imagination, or to think or feel through images, would become his mode of expression. Paulismo was replaced by intersectionism, characterized by an accumulation of images with different origins. March of 1914 saw the most prolific month of his life. In his room one day, standing up, he composed 30-some poems. He titled them O Guardador de Rebanhos, the shepherd's keeper. He considered them to be his best poetry, the most sincere, the most inspired. Intersectionism was replaced by sensationism, the movement that Pessoa defined and developed in greatest detail. Sensationism was based on futurism. But while the futurists accepted chaos, Pessoa's work reflected a desire to accept and reconcile opposites, but attempting to find order in everything. Ode Marítima, Maritime Ode, composed by his heteronym Alberto Campos, and published for the first time in Orfeu, is an example of this style. April of 1915 saw the first number of Orfeu, a symbolist magazine. July would see the second and last issue. The public was outraged and reacted with indignation. Insults and jokes welcomed the pieces by Sá Carneiro and Álvaro de Campos, one of Pessoa's heteronyms, and the collage of Santa Rita Pintor. The magazine Orfeu, which was ridicularized by its contemporaries, would be consecrated by posterity as a symbol of a literary and aesthetic avant-garde. The magazine, besides the interest it showed in the renewal of ideas, was a novelty through being a joint Portuguese-Brazilian venture. Its editors were Luís de Montalvor of Portugal and Ronaldo de Carvalho of Brazil. In January of 1915, the poet was suffering financial difficulties and lived in the attic of a milk shop, rent-free, due to the generosity of the owner, an almost illiterate man from the Alentejo who greatly admired the poet. He lived there until 1917. In April of 1915, he was invited to write in a friend's newspaper, O Jornal. Soon he was fired because his remarks offended some readers. In O Jornal, he attacked integralism, a nationalistic movement oriented to the extreme right, anti-Semitic, and against Protestantism. Integralismo lusitano was the major influence in the development of Portuguese fascism. Theosophy began to interest him, and he translated Charles W. Leadbeater and Aníbal Santos' works into Portuguese. In 1916, his friend Mário de Sá Carneiro committed suicide in Paris. Pessoa began to experience mediunic phenomena, such as automatic writing. He believed he could distinguish a magnetic aura in people. In March of 1916, coming home after a late evening at a coffee house, the Brasileira, he felt forced to write, signing the papers with a name he had never heard, Manuel Gualdino da Cunha. He was attracted to occultism and learned to cast horoscopes. Edgar Allan Poe, father of the modernist movement in America, was one of Pessoa's favorite authors. He chose to translate him into Portuguese. An introvert by nature, he was reluctant to talk about his own work. Yet he possessed a sense of humor and intellectual qualities which were admired by his friends. Only in the company of family or of close friends did his withdrawn behavior disappear. Heavy drinking, which caused his death at age 47, often aggravated his mental and physical condition. In April of 1917, the First World War was raging in Europe. Pessoa introduced Portugal Futurista, headed by Almada Negreiros. The magazine was promptly seized by the police. Pessoa wrote under the pseudonym of Álvaro de Campos. In his piece Ultimatum, he stressed the tenets of another artistic movement, Futurism. Futurism stressed the need to abolish individuality and create a personality amalgamating states of being. In Ultimatum, he attacked the concept of democracy. He felt no love for political parties because he felt they do not represent the majority of people, but simply between them minorities within the electorate. Likewise, he did not consider that the winner of an election was necessarily the best man to govern the nation. He admired Greek culture and believed that the Portuguese should revitalize the Greek tradition of government. Pessoa rejected all forms of government which are non-aristocratic. In April of 1918, Santa Rita Pintor, a Portuguese artist who had brought the Futurism movement to Portugal, died of blood poisoning, but the word Futurism had taken root in Portugal. In 1918, he published privately in Lisbon 2 pamphlets of English poetry, Antinous and 35 sonnets. The Glasgow Herald of September 19, 1918, and the Times of London in 1914 had written appreciative comments on Antinous. Also in 1915, Pessoa had written in Portuguese, Salutation to Walt Whitman. When the war ended, the poet was 30 years old. Economic prosperity in Lisbon improved his economic condition as well. He opened a printing company and owned a home on the Largo do Corpo Santo. A 19-year-old girl who worked in his office attracted him, and he wrote her humble love letters. The girl, Ofélia Queiroz, did not seem to be interested at first, but slowly the courtship progressed. Pessoa called her Bebé, but complained he bored her. On March the 30th, 1920, 58 years old and partially paralyzed, his mother returned to Lisbon. The poet moved in with her, and his relationship with Ofélia cooled off. He wrote that he planned on entering a sanatory to cure him of the black wave that was engulfing him. Later he would write to Ofélia that his life revolved around his literary creations, that he loved her very much, and that should he marry, he would marry her. But he believed that marriage would not agree with his life of thought. Some ascribe an ambiguous sexuality to Pessoa and give the poem Epithalamium as the reason. Epithalamium was written in English, and the reason he gave for his composition was the desire to eliminate certain elements in his character that interfere with his mental processes. Epithalamium describes a bride shy and fearful on her wedding night. Epithalamium, as well as Antinous, Pessoa's homosexual poem, were composed in English in 1915. In 1920, his English poem Meantime was published in the Athenaeum of London, and he finished composing a group of English poems, Inscriptions. In Inscriptions, published in 1921, he tried to recreate the pagan mood of antiquity and stressed the duality of life and death. Also in 1920, he published A Memória do Presidente Rei Sidónio Paz. Sidónio Paz ruled Portugal as a dictator. When Portugal entered the First World War, food shortages and political instability were rampant. Strikes, increased censorship, and the devaluation of the escudo provoked Sidónio Paz's assassination on December the 14th, 1918. Fernando Pessoa saw in this politician certain qualities that conformed to his political ideology. In 1922 appeared O Banqueiro Anarquista, Pessoa's first contribution to Contemporânea, a new literary magazine. In 1923, the Action League of the Students of Lisbon announced its rebellion against the literature of Sodom, a morality movement against Portugal's vanguard artists. Fernando Pessoa became involved in the dispute and defended the writer Raul Leal, who had been attacked by the League. 1924 saw the arrival of Surrealism, a movement related to Sigmund Freud and to psychoanalysis. To this movement is ascribed Pessoa's composition Para Além do Outro Oceano, under the heteronym C. Pacheco. For the first time in Portuguese, the uncontrolled automation of thought, stream of consciousness, was expressed, creating a mental life, a mystical state of spirit. Pessoa and a friend, Rui Vaz, joined efforts to publish yet another magazine, Athena. Athena would last only 5 months, and there he would print his translation of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, one of his favorite authors. In 1926, he applied for a patent on his invention, synthetic yearly calendar by name and any other classification consultable in any language. In the same year, he published his poem O Menino de Sua Mãe, his mother's very own, in the journal Contemporâneo. His own mother had died the previous year. In 1927, José Régio, Portugal's best-known surviving poet, published in the journal Presença the first critical article on the new poetry to single out the work of the master, Fernando Pessoa. José Régio called him the richest of our modernists. In June of 1927, his poem Marinha was published in Presença. The poet would continue to write in Presença until his death. In 1938, Presença would also publish Indícios de Ouro, Sá Carneiro's posthumous book. The editors of Presença gave Fernando Pessoa a critical understanding that the poet found very gratifying. It was in Presença that the only In Memoriam, inspired by his death, was published in July of 1936. The first anthology devoted to the work of the poet's several heteronyms will be published by Adolfo Casais Monteiro, one of the editors of Presença. Another revolution in 1926, under the leadership of General Gomes da Costa, followed another period of political instability. Carmona was elected president in March of 1928, and António Salazar became Minister of Finance. Fernando Pessoa published Interregno, Defesa e Justificação da Ditadura Militar in Portugal. He proposed the dictatorship as a temporary state of transition. In a later note written in March 30th, 1935, he would give a statement of his political ideology. I had considered that the monarchical system would be the most appropriate for an organically imperial nation such as Portugal. I had also considered the monarchy completely unfeasible in Portugal. For that reason, in the event of a plebiscite between regimes, I would vote, although regretfully, for the Republic. I am a conservative in the English style, that is, liberal within conservatism, and absolutely anti-reactionary. Salazar in 1933 began to elaborate reforms which led Estado Novo into fascismo. Pessoa attacked fascism as early as 1915 with the publication of O Preconceito da Ordem. He wrote 4 poems attacking Salazar and the Estado Novo. One was dated July 29, 1935, 4 months before his death. In 1929, a full-length study of the poet's personality appeared in Temas, a book by João Gaspar Simões, who later would become Pessoa's biographer. Also in 1929, he began the second phase of his epistolary correspondence with Ofélia Queiroz. In 1930, he started a correspondence with Alistair Crowley, a writer and astrologer from London who visited the poet in Portugal. In 1933, he wrote technical articles to the magazine he directed with his brother-in-law, Revista do Comércio e Contabilidade, as well as to the magazine Presença. He also tried to organize the poems of his heteronyms in a book which he believed to be a financial failure. Generously, he also revised poems of his deceased friend Mário de Sá Carneiro that he wanted to publish. In 1932, he applied for the position of curator at the Museum Library of Conde de Castro Guimarães in Cascais, but was refused. His drinking problem was aggravated, as was his mental condition. In 1934, he entered a literary contest with his book Mensagem, but lost to another poet said to be more popular, more Christian. He received the consolation prize only because António Ferro, another poet, was a member of the jury. He defended the Masonic order and the right of secret association to assemble. In the evening of November 27, 1935, he fell ill and entered St. Louis Hospital upon his doctor's insistence. He remembered it was his sister's birthday and asked a friend to send her a telegram. Shortly before his death, his eyes became cloudy and he asked for his glasses. Those were his last words. He died November the 30th, 1935, of cirrhosis of the liver, aged 47. 2 days earlier, he had met with Gaspar Simões and Almada Negreiros at the Café Martinho in the arcades of Terreiro do Paço, one of the poet's favorite places. Fernando Pessoa and Gaspar Simões had been collaborating on the magazine Sudoeste, which was founded by Almada Negreiros. Almada Negreiros recently arrived in Portugal after a long stay abroad, wanted to pay homage to the 2 generations represented by the revolutionary Orfeu and by Presença, the 2 most representative currents of the Portuguese modernism. In the second part of our program, we will talk about the genesis of the heteronyms.
In this second part, which you'll be seeing today, Mrs. Lippert will give us more information on the genesis of Pessoa's heteronyms, and she will recite his poetry bilingually in English and in Portuguese. I hope you enjoy today's program and will tune in to other programs.
Much of Fernando Pessoa's prose and poetry was written under pseudonyms, such as Alexander Search, Álvaro de Campos, Alberto Caeiro, and Ricardo Reis, to name but a few. There were 19. However, the poet insisted that his other names were not simply pseudonyms of the type adopted by other writers for reasons of modesty or convenience. Other Portuguese authors had made use of alter egos, Almeida Garré created João Mínimo, and Essa de Queiroz, Carlos Fradique Mendes. The philosopher Kierkegaard also wrote under different names, as did the Bronte sisters in England and the French writer Flaubert. For Fernando Pessoa, these alter egos had real personalities and were based on the principle of the impersonality of art. He believed that no artist should have only one personality, but rather that he or she should be a synthesis of the various personalities that go to make his or her own character, and that they should reflect the thought of his or her own time. A few months before his death, he expanded on the psychological reasons for his theory. He attributed the need for heteronymy to the element of hysteria in his makeup. He believed he had a constant and organic tendency towards the personalization and make-believe, and he wrote, "Ever since I was a child, I have intended to create around me a fictitious world, to surround myself with friends and acquaintances who never existed." Pessoa's first fictitious character was created when the poet was 6 years old, the Chevalier de Pas, in whose name he wrote letters addressed to himself. Alexander Search, his second, came into being during his teenage years in South Africa. March 8, 1914, saw the stream of 30 and some poems in one evening. He ascribed them to Alberto Caeiro. Ricardo Reis, Álvaro de Campos were soon to follow. These mental creations were given elaborate biographical data and even had horoscopes cast for them. In an article published anonymously in the magazine Presença in 1928, he wrote, "A pseudonymic work is, except for the name with which it is signed, the work of an author writing as himself. A heteronymic work is by an author writing outside his own personality. It is the work of a complete individuality made up by him." The Mexican poet Octavio Paz, who translated Fernando Pessoa into Spanish, has stated that Caeiro, Reis, and Campos are the heroes of a novel Pessoa never wrote. T.S. Eliot has said that poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Here is one justification for heteronymy. Briefly, a description of the physical and mental characteristics of the poet's more relevant mental creations, his heteronyms, yields the following. Alberto Caeiro, born in 1889, fair and blue-eyed, died of tuberculosis at age 26. Many of his poems were published posthumously. The themes of his poetry are those of childlike wonder at the ways of nature. Caeiro is a reinterpretation of man in a state of innocence, living the golden age of the countryside, as opposed to the modern age of technology. Certain aspects of his philosophy anticipate modern existentialism. In his poetry, he tries to avoid poetic imagery and reproduce the rhythms of everyday speech. He makes use of antithesis, paradox, and syllogism. His poetry is said to have been written by a Portuguese, D.H. Lawrence. Alberto Caeiro is the author of The Keeper of Flocks, o guardador de rebanhos. O luar, quando bate na relva, não sei que coisa me lembra. Lembra-me a voz da criada velha, contando-me contos de fadas. E de como Nossa Senhora, vestida de mendiga, andava à noite nas estradas, socorrendo as crianças maltratadas. Se eu já não posso crer que isso é verdade, para que bate o luar na relva? The English translation of The Keeper of Flocks was done by Jean R. Longland. The moonlight, when it strikes the grass, what it recalls, I do not know. It recalls our old servant's voice telling me fairy tales, and about Our Lady in beggar's clothes, walking at night along the roads, rescuing children from abuse. If I can no longer believe that this is true, why does the moonlight strike the grass? Ricardo Reis, another heteronym, was shorter, stronger, and sallower than Caeiro. Born in Oporto and educated in a Jesuit school, he was a doctor by profession and a monarchist. He lived in exile in Brazil. Ricardo Reis is like Caeiro, a poet of the countryside. The pagan gods are real to him. Reis, a fatalist and hostile to Christianity, admires Christ with an appreciation that is aesthetic rather than spiritual. He feels the gods are bound by the same laws of fate as man is, and that feeling is dominated by the intellect. Life and destiny are to be accepted with resignation because there is no possibility of changing human existence. Ricardo Reis' poetry shows a refined vocabulary. He uses the oration ode adopted to the Portuguese language. Latinisms, archaisms, Hellenisms, and an almost absence of rhyme are noticed in his work. Para ser grande, ser inteiro. Nada teu exagera ou exclui. Sê todo em cada coisa. Põe quanto és no mínimo que fazes. Assim, em cada lago, a lua toda brilha, porque alta vive. The English translation of this poem was done by Jean R. Longland. To be great, behold. Nothing of yours enlarge or exclude. Be complete in each thing. Pull all you are in the least you do. So in every lake, the whole moon shines. She rides so high. Álvaro de Campos, the most prolific of Pessoa's creations, is a personification of modern European man and said to be the most American of his heteronyms. Born in the Algarve, he had studied in Scotland and was a naval engineer. Tall and thin, a Portuguese Jewish type, he wore a monocle. A trip to the Orient persuaded him to write Opiário. Álvaro de Campos was strongly influenced by the American poet Walt Whitman and showed a preoccupation with industrial realities and the material wishes of the age. He wrote Ode Triumphal Ode, celebrating the world of technology. However, he realizes that the machine does not solve the problem of his human condition, and he chooses an alternative solution, an introverted attitude. He lacks willpower and feels discontent with himself and others. In Ode Marítima, Maritime Ode, the poet tries to recapture the past associated with dreams of childhood and adolescence. This lengthy poem of 903 lines appeared at first in the magazine Orfeu. The poetic persona final acknowledgement that the adult cannot transcend his or her time conditions leads to anguish, isolation, and tedium. These are the poems Trapo and Bicarbonato de Soda portray the ennui of modern life. Álvaro de Campos' composition showed the different stylistic attitudes, starting with the sonnet and the quatrain in his first phase. In his second, it is noticed a greater freedom of form, showing futuristic tendencies. He uses word association and foreign words. Freedom of punctuation, a tenet of the Futurism movement, which had been stressed by its founder Marinetti, is also present in his poetry. In his third phase, he makes use of slang in an attempt to capture a prosaic type of Portuguese. Dobrada à moda do Porto, trite ou Porto style. Dia num restaurante, fora do espaço e do tempo, serviram-me o amor como dobrada fria. Disse delicadamente ao missionário da cozinha que a preferia quente, que a dobrada era a moda do Porto, nunca se come fria. Impacientaram-se comigo. Nunca se pode ter razão, nem num restaurante. Não comi, não pedi outra coisa. Paguei a conta e vim passear para toda a rua. Quem sabe o que isto quer dizer? Eu não sei, e foi comigo. Sei muito bem que na infância de toda a gente houve um jardim, particular ao público ou do vizinho. Sei muito bem que brincarmos era o dono dele e que a tristeza é de hoje. Sei isso muitas vezes, mas se eu pedi amor, por que é que me trouxeram dobrada à moda do Porto fria? Não é prato que se possa comer frio, mas trouxeram-me frio. Não me queixei, mas estava frio. Tripe, o Porto Style. Once in a restaurant outside of space and time, they served me love like cold tripe. I politely told the missionary from the kitchen that I preferred it hot, that tripe, and it was Oporto style, is never eaten cold. They were annoyed with me. One can never be right, even in a restaurant. I did not eat it. I did not order something else. I paid the bill and went out to walk the length of the street. Who knows what this means? I don't know, and it happened to me. I know very well that in everyone's childhood there was a garden, private or public, or a neighbor's. I know very well that our playing was owning it, and that the sadness is of today. I know that over and over. But if I ordered love, why did they bring me cold tripe or Porto style? This is no dish to be eaten cold, but they brought it cold. I did not complain, but it was cold. It can never be eaten cold, but it came to me cold. The heteronyms account for almost half of Pessoa's poetic output. The poetry published under the name Fernando Pessoa is mainly short and in conventional rhyming patterns, but there exists two other bodies of work, a forced fragment, partly rhymed, partly free verse, and the sequence Mensagem, Message, which was the only volume of Portuguese poems published in the poet's lifetime. The common thread running through both heteronymic and orthonymic poetry is life, its mystery and its ramifications. Another is the poet's preoccupation with the dichotomy sincerity-insincerity. In 1916 he wrote, "Sincerity is the one great artistic crime. Insincerity is the second greatest. The great artist should never have a really fundamental and sincere opinion about life, but that should give him the capacity to feel sincere, nay, to be absolutely sincere about anything for a certain length of time. That length of time, say, which is necessary for a poem to be conceived and written." Religious skepticism, a belief that no religion holds or can ever hold the truth, is also expressed. In a letter to the writer Casais Monteiro, on January the 13th, 1935, he wrote, "I believe in the existence of inhabited worlds which are on a higher plane than ours. I believe in the experience of various degrees of spirituality, becoming more rarefied until we arrive at a supreme being, which presumably created this world. I do not believe in direct communication with God, but according to our degree of spiritual refinement, we shall be able to communicate with progressively higher beings." Occultism and metaphysics are central to Pessoa's poetry. The philosophers Nietzsche and Schopenhauer are said to have influenced him, just as did Walt Whitman, Shakespeare, and Wordsworth. His poems show the use of simile and metaphor. There is a rich imagery, and the choice of words and quality of sound achieve a musical quality. The surge of patriotism the poet experienced after his return to Portugal is well represented in O Mostrengo, The Spectre, composed in September of 1918. O mostrengo que está no fim do mar, na noite de breu ergueu-se a voar. A rosa da nau voou 3 vezes a chiar, e disse: "Quem é que ousou entrar nas minhas cavernas que não desvendo, meus tetos negros do fim do mundo?" E o homem do leme disse, tremendo: "El rei Dom João II." "De quem são as velas onde me roço? De quem as quilhas que vejo e ouço?" Disse o mostrengo, e rodou 3 vezes rodou, imundo e grosso. "Quem vem poder o que só eu posso, que moro onde nunca ninguém me visse, e escorro os dedos do mar sem fundo?" E o homem do leme tremeu e disse: "El rei Dom João II." 3 vezes do leme as mãos ergueu, 3 vezes do leme as repreendeu, e disse no fim de tremer 3 vezes: "Aqui, ó leme, sou mais do que eu, sou um povo que quer o mar que é teu. E mais que o mostrengo, o que minha alma teme e roda nas trevas do fim do mundo, manda a vontade que me ata ao leme del rei Dom João II." The spectre at the end of the sea whirled upward through the pitch dark night. Around the ship 3 times he whirled, 3 times he clamoured as he whirled, and shrieked, "My caves I guard from sight, my ebony roofs are the end of the world. Who is it that dares challenge me?" The helmsman answered, shuddering, "Dom João II, Lord and King." Whose are the sails that loom so near? Whose are the keels I see and hear? The spectre shrieked, 3 times he whirled, filthy and gross, 3 times he whirled. I live where none has sighted me. I drain the fears from the bottomless sea. Who goes where only I can be? The helmsman answered, shuddering, Dom João II, Lord and King. 3 times he loosed the helm, and then 3 times he grasped the helm again. And after 3 times shuddering, "Here at the helm I am more than I. A people that craves your sea am I. More than the fearful spectre that whirled around me in dusk at the end of the world, what lashes me here is the order hurled by Dom João II, Lord and King." The theme of alienation and the search for self can be noticed in Gato que brincas na rua, Cat, you tumble down the street. Gato que brincas na rua, como se fosse na cama, invejo a sorte que é tua, porque nem sorte se chama. Bom servo das leis fatais, que regem pedras e gentes, que tens instintos gerais e sentes só o que sentes. És feliz porque és assim, todo o nada que és é teu. Eu vejo-me e estou sem mim, conheço-me e não sou eu. The translation of Cat, you tumble down the street was done by Edwin Hanig. Cat, you tumble down the street, as if you were your bed. I think such luck's a treat, like feeding without being fed. You are just a pawn in the hands of fate, as stones are in people. You follow your instinct and glance. What you feel, it's simple. Because you are like that, you are happy. You are all the nothing you see. I look at myself, it's not me. I know myself, I am not I. The next poem was most likely inspired by Ofélia Queiroz. Dá a surpresa de ser, é alta, de um louro escuro, faz bem só pensar em ver seu corpo meio maduro. Seus seios altos parecem, se ela estivesse deitada, 2 montinhos que amanhecem sem ter que haver madrugada. E a mão do seu braço branco assenta em palmo espalhado sobre a saliência do flanco do seu relevo tapado. Apetece como um barco, tem qualquer coisa de gomo. Meu Deus, quando é que eu embarco? Oh fome, quando é que eu como? She brings the surprise of being, she is tall, of a dark blonde. It does good only to think of seeing her almost ripe body. If she lay down, her high breasts would seem 2 little hills which dawn without need for twilight. And the hand is spread, her white arms fifth, on the salience of a flank of her clothed relief. Enticing as a boat, like a piece of lemon. When, God, shall I embark? When, hunger, eat? And finally, the well-known Mar Português, the Portuguese Sea. Ó mar salgado, quanto do teu sal são lágrimas de Portugal. Por te cruzarmos, quantas mães choraram, quantos filhos em vão rezaram, quantas noivas ficaram por casar, para que fosses nosso, ó mar. Valeu a pena? Tudo vale a pena, se a alma não é pequena. Quem quer passar além do bujador, tem que passar além da dor. Deus ao mar o perigo e o abismo deu, mas nele é que espelhou o céu. The translation of Mar Português was done by F.E.G. Quintanilha. Oh salty sea, how much of your salt are tears of Portugal. For us to sail you, how many mothers cried, how many sons prayed in vain, how many brides stayed unmarried just for you to be ours, oh sea. Was it worth it? Everything is worthwhile if the soul is not mean. Whoever wants to sail beyond the bujador must go beyond anguish. God gave the sea danger and depth, but in it mirrored the sky. Fernando Pessoa's output in Portuguese, English and French include poetry and observations written in prose on aesthetics, literary criticism, philosophy, politics, religion and sociology. They represent a wide-ranging body of work, but many of his plans never came to fruition. He had plans to translate the complete works of Shakespeare, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost. Pessoa did not publish a large number of poems in English, although he kept writing in this language until 1935, including his last poem written 1 week before he died. Some claim that the only reason he wrote the 35 English sonnets was the fascination he felt for the sonnets of Shakespeare and of his wish to attempt an adaptation of them in a form he found suitable for 20th century minds. Having proclaimed that art should interpret the age of technology, he followed this path in a few poems, such as in Triumphal Ode and others. Yet his obsession would be the search for his ego, the limitations of the human condition, solitude, and the transience of life. His heteronymic theory is said to have come from two sources. First, a desire to hide and reveal himself simultaneously, and secondly, a need for intelligent appreciation by his friends and eventually by the public. A vast number of poems and writings in prose, especially in English and in French, still await publication. The poet had thought of translating some of his poetry and that of his contemporaries and have it published in Great Britain. He constantly searched for different forms of poetry, from the classical ode to the Renaissance sonnet to the popular and traditional Portuguese poetry to blank verse. He never committed himself completely to movements that were too free. The structure of his sentences follows the logical sequence of a syllogism, arguing out something, often of a paradoxical nature. He attempted to put Portuguese poetry on a par with European movements of the period. He was a modernist, albeit a moderate one, when the modernist movement was ridicularized in Portugal and in other European countries. He was an innovator who dared to experiment. He was argumentative and had the gift of intellectual curiosity. He believed in the value of his work, and he manifested this belief on several occasions. By his work, Portuguese literature took its place among the European literary movements of the beginning of this century and earned him a place in literary history close to Camões. As it was remarked during the first International Symposium on Fernando Pessoa, held at Brown University in the fall of 1977, Fernando Pessoa and his work are still terra incognita in the United States. This for a poet who today is considered one of the supreme representatives of Portuguese culture in the whole world. We hope our small contribution will help to make Fernando Pessoa better known among the American people.